Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's virtual town hall hosted by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. My name is Eric White. I have the honor to serve as the District Director for Congresswoman Pressley's Boston office, serving all the residents of the Massachusetts 7th. Now tonight, Congresswoman Pressley will provide a congressional update, and then we will try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all of the questions that are submitted tonight. We've had more than 40 pre-submitted questions, and we thank everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. But we will take pre-submitted and live questions tonight. And so if you would like to post a question, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom link. And if you put your name against the question, we will do our very best to answer every question we do not get to tonight following tonight's town hall. If you would like to contact our office, please visit our website at pressley.house.gov or call our district office directly at 617-850-0040. Again, that is pressley.house.gov or 617-850-0040. Now I'd like to turn it over to our Congresswoman to share an update from Washington, and then we will get right into your questions. Congresswoman?
Thank you, Eric, and good evening, everyone. It is good to be home, good to be in the Massachusetts 7th, and good to be in virtual community with all of you this evening. Thank you for making the time to participate in our most recent town hall convening. Of course, we continue to be met with unprecedented challenges during this unprecedented time for our Commonwealth, for the Massachusetts 7th, and our country. But I do just want to take a moment to thank you for meeting these unprecedented times with collective care and mutual aid and unprecedented community. It is humbling and the greatest honor of my life to represent you as your Congresswoman and to cooperatively govern alongside you. But I do want to talk about and be frank about the challenges that we are confronted with and how we should go about addressing those challenges. And so we do continue to find ourselves in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic, which has robbed us of more than 750,000 lives. We have witnessed firsthand the tragic consequences of generations of underinvestment and what I would characterize as policy violence inflicted on our most vulnerable and marginalized communities, crumbling housing stock and the affordable housing crisis, a lack of paid leave and meaningful investments in home and community-based services, the skyrocketing cost of childcare. Massachusetts has the second highest cost of childcare in the country at nearly $21,000 per child for center-based care, and a childcare workforce comprised mostly of women and women of color who do the extraordinary and important work of taking care of our babies, setting them on a pathway to better health outcomes and ultimately to making their contributions in the world, but many of them cannot provide for their own babies. And of course, the existential threat of climate change, which threatens every aspect of our society. Our families and our communities have experienced unprecedented hardship, and as policymakers in this unprecedented moment, it is our imperative and we have a responsibility to meet the moment with urgency and to advance policies and budgets that will have a meaningful and tangible impact on the lives of the people that we represent. Budgets which codify the value of every life and policies which acknowledge our intersectional realities. You sent me to Congress to fight for every worker, every family, and every community across the Massachusetts 7th, to lead with compassion, empathy, and resolve, to never give up the fight, even when it may not be the easiest thing to do, and yes, even when it may not be the popular thing to do. So I am exceedingly grateful for the opportunity to speak directly to you this evening, my community, my constituents, and to answer your questions. Before getting into that, I do want to take a moment to provide you with an update on our work fighting to advance President Biden's full Build Back Better agenda. This is the president's agenda. It is the people's agenda. And I want to share with you why I voted no on the bipartisan infrastructure bill on Friday. For months, my progressive colleagues and many more have been holding the line to deliver much needed aid and resources to our communities, because we know that if our nation is truly going to build back better, we need bold investments to address both the human and physical infrastructure needs of our country. Of course, that means investing in our roads, bridges, and public transportation systems, but also in things like housing, paid family and medical leave, affordable childcare, universal pre-K, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, and providing home and community-based services for the elderly and disabled, a wait list that is thousands long. Investments in combating the existential threat of climate change, and yes, providing critical protections for our immigrant neighbors, the same ones that so many of us celebrated, who kept us fed and safe in the midst of this pandemic. Because infrastructure is all of those things that are essential to the functioning of our society. It's what allows everyone in society to meet their most basic needs and to bring to bear their contributions. We've been hard at work making the case for investments in both the human infrastructure, Build Back Better Act. It's been frustrating to see the Build Back Better Act characterized as social spending. These are investments, and we need these investments in human and social infrastructure in the Build Back Better Act, and we need hard infrastructure in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I've been fighting for these two bills to move together, not just because they are equally as important, but because they are mutually beneficial. I made my position clear from the start, and it was one developed in partnership with community. I couldn't support the Roads and Bridges infrastructure bill without advancing the Build Back Better Act with investments in our families and workers. Now, the calls to pass both bills together wasn't one made for efficiency's sake. It has always been about the policy, about the substance and the impact. Passing both bills together would ensure that we are taking meaningful climate action to reduce carbon emissions. Passing both bills together was the climate compromise, combined with the Build Back Better Act's investments in our clean energy future, environmental justice, green jobs, and climate resilience. Both bills combined would have a net positive impact. Passing both bills together would establish millions of good-paying union jobs and help provide workers and families with the supports like affordable housing, paid leave, and childcare necessary to actually take on those jobs and to get back on track. Both bills are necessary to ensure that we build back better, equitably, that we leave no one behind, no worker, no family, no community. After months of hard work, we were on path to do exactly that. And Friday, I entered the building ready and enthusiastic to make historic transformative change by voting yes on both of these bills, according to the compromise which had been agreed to. But unfortunately, just hours before the vote, a small number of my conservative colleagues decided they could not vote on the Build Back Better Act and began moving the goalposts, demanding additional conditions that would halt the bill in its tracks, claiming cost and deficit concerns. Unfortunately, the level of obstruction was very on brand, and time again, life-saving resources to workers, to our families and our communities are cut, narrowed, and compromised. And all of the talk about numbers, I think what's gotten lost in this is substance and impact and the people, all of the people. There is no deficit of resource. Look at the Pentagon budget, a $750 billion defense bill. So there is no deficit of resource. There is only a deficit of empathy and prioritization. Over the last several weeks, I have met with parents and childcare workers. I've stood in solidarity with climate justice organizers and affordable housing activists. I have met with immigrant justice organizers and TPS recipients. I promised them that I would continue holding the line to ensure both bills make meaningful, impactful progress so that we leave no worker, no family, and no community behind. I needed to honor that commitment to my constituents. I needed to honor my word. So on Friday, when we were forced to vote on the infrastructure bill alone, without honoring the compromise to move both of those bills together, I voted no. Now, some of you might ask, isn't it better to get something instead of nothing? Well, to that I would say that something has always left behind the most vulnerable. And I will not turn my back on any of my constituents, especially not our most vulnerable. Despite my no vote and calls that we delay the vote for passage to next week, the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed. With the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed, we have a lot less leverage to ensure that the robust investments remain intact in the House as it heads to the Senate. Paid leave, essential infrastructure at some point in our lives. I know I was a caregiver to my mother in her leukemia battle. At some point in our lives, we will all care for someone or need to be cared for. Paid leave, immigration protections for so many of those essential workers who were on the front lines, families who took care of us, kept us safe, kept us fed, still living on the margins and in the shadows. Climate justice. I have some of the highest rates of asthma in my district. Communities disproportionately bearing the burden of environmental injustices, living in subpar housing, transportation deserts, a lack of tree canopies and equity in that way. And of course, in addition to paid leave, immigration protections, and climate justice in the Build Back Better Act, which I worry that we have lost our leverage to advance, the need to lower the cost of prescription drugs. And so much more is on the line. And housing, the number one call that in terms of need that my district office receives is for affordable housing. So despite the fact that we have ceded our leverage to advance fully the people's agenda, which is the president's agenda, I remain optimistic and determined to get the Build Back Better Act passed. I will close with this. The Massachusetts 7th is a vibrant, diverse, and dynamic district. And it is also one of the most unequal in our country, and certainly the most unequal in our congressional delegation. That was true well before COVID-19, and the pandemic has only made things worse. So we can't simply return or recover to a pre-COVID status quo unjust normal. A status quo normal that in a 3-mile radius in my district, from Cambridge to Roxbury, where life expectancy drops by 30 years and median household income by $50,000. We have to be deliberate and intentional. We have to advance budgets and policies that go as bold, as broadly, and as deeply as the hurt is. We have to be intentional about charting a better path forward and begin laying the groundwork for a just, equitable, and robust recovery. And that work in earnest begins with our ensuring that we advance the president's full agenda, which includes the president's Build Back Better Act. You deserve nothing less. I look forward to answering your questions and can't wait to hear from you. So let's dive right in.
Great. Thank you, Congresswoman. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining tonight, and to those that submitted pre-submitted questions for tonight's town hall. We will try to get through as many as we can. Again, unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all the questions live, but our staff will be following up with everyone who submits questions this evening. So let's just jump right in. Okay, so our first question comes from Clarissa in Boston. Clarissa asks, so what are the next steps to pass the Build Back Better Act? And do you think it'll pass now that the infrastructure bill is done?
Clarissa, thank you for your question. And As it stands right now, and again, we've been negotiating in good faith with people that we're not negotiating with that same good faith, but I'm cautiously optimistic. We are scheduled to return to Washington to vote on the Build Back Better Act the week of the 15th. And in the meantime, we need to wait for the Congressional Budget Office to deliver a score, which is the cost estimate of the total bill. Now, regardless of that score, because my colleagues have expressed concerns about it potentially contributing to our deficit. Never mind that the bipartisan infrastructure bill has not been scored, and it is expected to contribute to the deficit. But the point is, regardless of that score, we need to be prepared to be all hands on deck in pushing back against any efforts to further cut down this bill, because we have been compromising. I'm new relatively to Congress, but not to legislating. I don't believe in allowing perfection to be the enemy of good, and understand that the process of legislating is about negotiating and compromising. And we're never going to get everything that you want. I never want to lead the army of no, only yes if. And so we made a number of concessions and compromises. And so I think that we need to continue to hold our colleagues accountable to keep their word. And again, to ensure that there are not any additional compromises made, because those compromises will have adverse implications on our ability to take care of every worker, to take care of every family, to take care of every community. Having served on the municipal level for some 8 years, and as an aide in the Senate for 11 and in the House for 4, I'm used to these unjust binary choices that have been foisted onto us for decades. And I reject those binary choices. They are false. We can take care of the union worker who builds the road and the child care worker that makes it possible for that laborer to go and to do that work. And so November 15th is contingent upon my colleagues receiving that Congressional Budget Office score is when we are expected to vote on the Build Back Better Act. And I'm hopeful that we'll get this done. And again, I plan to hold my colleagues to their word to bring this bill up for a vote. Now, procedurally, and perhaps I'm telling you more than you even want to know, but I do just want to give you some more insight in terms of the technicalities of this. The bill will need to go through what is known as the Byrd Rule, which requires all provisions to have a budget impact in order to keep the bill on the expedited reconciliation process. So, we're closer than ever before to delivering on universal pre-K, on affordable childcare, on paid leave, on investing in home and community-based services for the disabled and the elderly, combating our housing crisis, and tackling climate change. And we just cannot let up. We have to keep the pressure up. So I'm cautiously optimistic, leaving nothing to chance. And I look forward to returning to Washington the week of the 15th, and I'll be fighting tooth and nail to get this bill across the finish line.
Great. Thanks, Congresswoman. So our second question comes from Brandon in Somerville, who asks, wouldn't the infrastructure bill help workers in your district by creating millions of jobs? If so, how could you vote no?
Oh, thank you, Brandon, from Somerville, for that question. And there is no question about it. The infrastructure bill will help us to create good paying union jobs, to repair our roads, our bridges, our highways, and clean water systems. I'm co-chair of the Future of Transportation Caucus. I've long been an advocate for transit justice. I support these efforts. This is exactly why on Friday, I was prepared to vote yes on this bill together with the Build Back Better Act, consistent with the compromise that had been made and the commitments that I made to many of my constituents. We need these types of projects to begin building the equitable recovery that our communities deserve. But it is equally as critical to ensure that these workers and all workers have the housing, childcare, and paid leave supports necessary to ensure that they can get back to work. I've long been a champion of working families and a friend to labor. And one of the things that I love about the labor movement is when we greet one another, we greet each other as brother and sister. And why is that? It's because there is an acknowledgement that we are one human family and that our freedoms and our destinies are tied, which is why you'll see electrical workers standing side by side with nurses at St. Vincent. And the list goes on and on. And so I've spoken to my friends in labor, and they share my commitment to that childcare workforce. They share my commitment to the women in their families and in their communities who've been forced to drop out of the workforce during this pandemic at disproportionately much higher rates than our male counterparts. Some 2 million plus women have left the workforce because of a lack of access to paid leave and to childcare. And so again, this is about leaving no worker behind, no member of our community behind, no member of our family behind, both because that is the right thing to do and the just thing to do. But this is as much about our families as it is our GDP. How do we have an inclusive economy if we're leaving behind 50% of it? And so in closing, what I would just say here, Brandon, is that I don't define those building our highways, roads, and bridges simply by their labor. These workers belong to families, and those families are a part of communities. And I have to take care of those families holistically. And that does mean making sure that you have a job, but you also have housing that is affordable, and you're not paying more than 30% of your income to rent, or that you're on path to home ownership so that you can build wealth and equity. Have a responsibility to make sure that you not only have a job, but that you have access to quality, affordable childcare, and also to paid leave, and that you have breathable air and water that you can drink. All of these things matter. We don't live in big checked boxes. We live in an intersectional, nuanced reality. And I think it's incumbent upon us to meet the basic needs of every member of our community. And that's why we need the Build Back Better Act, because it is about social and human infrastructure. So my goal is to leave no worker, no family, and no community behind. And that means advancing the president's full agenda and investing in both the human and physical infrastructure needs of this Commonwealth and our country. So I just reject the false choice. I honor my promise that I made to my constituents to hold the line, to delay the bipartisan infrastructure bill, to keep our leverage in order to pass the Build Back Better Act. And I'll continue fighting for every worker and family in my district.
Great. Thanks, Congresswoman. So this question comes to us from the Q&A. We're going to bounce around and try to get as many as we can.
Okay.
So Congresswoman Omar,
I'll try to bring a little more brevity. Okay, my apologies. Let's go.
Well, this is very meaty stuff. So Omar asks about immigration. So Omar asks, what are you doing to fight for the inclusion of a pathway to citizenship for dreamers during this Congress? Additionally, what is the sentiment in Congress about whether or not these provisions will hold after review by the Senate parliamentarian?
Right. Well, again, this is why I've been reiterating throughout our time here today that there were concessions and compromises that have been made throughout this process. And that includes the certainty of a full path to citizenship, that we're taking care of our TPS holders, our DACA recipients, those with DED. But the Build Back Better Act does include protections for our immigrant neighbors in the form of parole. And again, that is a compromise from a full pathway to citizenship, even from the registry. That is a compromise. But essentially, these protections will allow certain folks, again, DACA beneficiaries, TPS holders, and certain essential workers and farm workers to apply for up to 10 years of protections from deportation, providing work authorization and eligibility for other benefits. And it's estimated that 7 million folks could be eligible for protections. So as I spoke with impacted families and our immigrant justice advocates, they said, look, if this is what we can get, then let's fight and make sure that it stays in there, because this will take care of some of the members of my family. And so this is certainly an important step, but it does fall short of the promise of a pathway of citizenship. And so I'm not going to stop fighting until we ensure that we do just that. And so far as the parliamentarian, Whatever the parliamentarian rules, that is a non-binding ruling. It's ostensibly an opinion, and it can be overruled. And I'll be, leaning on our colleagues in the Senate to consider that. But ultimately, I do think there is much work to be done in the form of potentially executive action by this White House in executive orders. And ultimately, we do need to abolish the filibuster. It is obstructing progress and justice at every turn.
Great. Thank you, Congresswoman. So our next question comes from Rhoda in Somerville, who asked about housing specifically. So what are you doing to make housing more affordable? I can barely afford my rent now, and the cost keeps increasing. My entire family lives in Somerville, and I don't want my children to have to leave the area.
Yeah. As I said, the Massachusetts 7th is one of the most unequal districts in the country, and it also has, some of the highest cost of living in the country. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to serve on the Financial Services Committee, and I'm grateful to have been appointed to that and to serve on that committee under the leadership of Chairwoman Maxine Waters. Housing is critical. It is a social determinant of health. It's critical to social and economic mobility. And I believe everyone deserves more than just shelter. They deserve to have a home. And we do have a housing affordability crisis. In Massachusetts, a minimum wage worker has to work 87 hours a week to afford a market rate 1-bedroom rental home. And then, of course, we know the reason why we have such a stark racial wealth gap in the Massachusetts 7th, specifically in Boston, has everything to do with disparate home ownership rates. In fact, Black home ownership rates are the lowest now than they've been since the FHA was introduced. So we're talking about over 50 years. Now, on the Financial Services Committee, I've been working hard to advance investments that will increase the availability of affordable housing while cracking down on private equity landlords and developers who continue to drive up the cost of rent. The Build Back Better Act will increase the supply of high-quality affordable housing through construction and rehabilitation of 1 million affordable housing units nationwide. Now, it also includes investments to incentivize the removal of exclusionary zoning policies. And in my time, my 8-year tenure on the Boston City Council, we certainly saw this as a barrier to growing our affordable housing stock. It will also expand rental assistance for low-income and senior renters and renters with disabilities. This is what the Build Back Better Act will do. And then included in the Build Back Better Act are tenets of some of my own legislation, including my down payment towards equity bill, which will be the first ever national program to provide down payment assistance to first-time, first-generation home buyers up to $25,000. This is game-changing. This will help folks purchase homes, and it will considerably shrink the racial home ownership gap, and in turn, shrink the racial wealth gap. The Build Back Better Act will also make our housing stock climate resilient. And finally, this is another bill of mine, improve the quality of public housing by removing lead, mold, and improving energy efficiency. I've spent many time with constituents in my district who live in public housing. We have not seen investments or upgrades in some of this housing since it was built in the 1930s. When I spent time with seniors living with backup raw sewage and rodent infestations and black mold, this is simply unacceptable. Just because people can't afford more doesn't mean they don't deserve better. And so the Build Back Better Act does include these robust investments in public housing as well. And, housing is a human right, period. Today, many of our families find themselves on the brink of eviction and homelessness. Eviction, which is a policy choice and a violent one, and being unhoused, which is equally violent and also a public health issue. So I've secured $46 billion in emergency rental assistance to help families get out of rental and utility debt that they incurred during the pandemic. And I continue to work with our local partners to get that money out and to get it into the hands of our families. So again, housing is fundamental to everything, is at the intersection of everything. And these are just some of the tenets of the Build Back Better Act and some of the bills that I've written and advanced that will help to both preserve and to grow our affordable housing stock. I also want to say that people do need to be making a living wage as well. So all of these things work together. When we make sure we have these robust investments in public transit, of which there is a lot in the Build Back Better Act, so that people are getting to work and getting to school and getting to childcare and getting to healthcare more rapidly, but most of all, connected to education and jobs. So you have to address those access issues when it comes to transit. People need to be working at a living wage, and then housing needs to be made more affordable. And this is how we get at that.
Great. Thanks, Congresswoman. So switching gears slightly, Joanna from Jamaica Plain asked a question about the need to fight against the unconstitutional attacks on reproductive freedom. This has been a top button issue for you, Congresswoman. So what can individual constituents do to help?
Joanna, thank you so much for the question. And I appreciate your asking what you can do, because clearly the extremism of our current Supreme Court proves that they are not on the side of the people when it comes to either housing rights, voting rights, or reproductive freedom. I'm very proud to chair the Abortion Rights and Access Task Force under the Pro-Choice Caucus. By the way, this is the first pro-choice majority Congress in the history of Congress. And so if the courts are not acting, it's important that Congress stand in the gap and that we act. And it's important that the movement of which it sounds like you're a part of, that you continue to keep the pressure up to ensure that we are protecting and advancing reproductive freedom. Abortion care is health care, and health care is a human right. And so, again, this is a pro-choice Democratic majority House, Senate, and White House, and we have to do everything possible to protect it as such. So we find ourselves in the midst of these unprecedented, I know I keep using that word, but it's the word du jour for the times we find ourselves in, of coordinated attacks on our reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy. Over the last decade, we have seen more than 500 abortion bans pushed through state legislatures. Elections matter. And the catastrophic consequences have targeted our most vulnerable, restricting access to low income and women of color. So thankfully here in the Commonwealth, and that's what I like to see us being pace setters for the nation, we have the Roe Act, which has codified abortion rights in state law. However, our destinies are tied. And so when you see harmful draconian abortion bans like what was passed in Texas with the SB 8 extreme 6-week abortion ban, which has pushed safe and legal abortion care out of reach for millions. And of course, we know that when we create these bans, when we restrict and limit access, it doesn't mean that people stop having abortions. It means they stop having safe legal abortions. Clinics all over the country are seeing increased patients because folks can't access care in their own state. Your ability to access health care should not be defined by geographical boundaries or lines. So this is building on another healthcare issue by contributing to backlogs in care for many other issues related to reproductive health care and maternal care. And as I mentioned, I chair the Abortion Rights and Access Task Force under the Pro-Choice Caucus. I partnered with Congresswoman Judy Chu, who's been introducing the Women's Health Protection Act, WIPA, since 2013, preparing to guard against a moment such as the one we find ourselves in. And so I'm an original co-lead of that bill, the Women's Health Protection Act, and that passed the House. That passed the House early this year, and now we need the Senate to follow suit. We urge them to bring it to a vote quickly and then to get it to the president's desk for signature. And then any day now, the Supreme Court is expected to rule on whether to keep SB 8 in effect. And then lastly, because we also have a fight coming up, and so you want to know what you can do, please continue to lean in and pay attention both to what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Mississippi. Every option has got to be on the table. Our reproductive rights and freedoms are on the line. And so Congress must act. And we thank you for your solidarity as a movement builder in that. Okay. And I'll make sure that we get you connected to some organizations. Joanna from Jamaica Plain, if you're not already plugged in, we'll make sure we tap you into some mobilization and activism efforts. Okay. Thank you for the question.
Great. Thanks, Congresswoman. So Carol from Randolph and Cassia from Everett asked similar questions. So they both asked for an update on the progress made in the fight for student loan cancellation.
Carol, thank you for asking this question. We are keeping the pressure up, and we have seen meaningful progress in the meantime. For those of you that are not aware, student debt is a nearly $2 trillion crisis. There are some who would like to define this and characterize it as a millennial or Gen Z issue. Not true. This is affecting people from every walk of life. I have constituents in my district, 76 years old, still paying on student debt. And of course, we have seen a number of our most vulnerable, including seniors and veterans, who have been victimized by the deceptive business practices and predatory marketing of for-profit colleges and universities, ensnaring them in a downward spiral. So this is a nearly $2 trillion crisis. It must be addressed. Early this year, myself, Senator Warren, and Leader Schumer were successful, along with advocates, in pushing the Biden administration to extend the pause on student loan payments. We wanted to do whatever we could to mitigate the hurt, to alleviate a bill in the midst of this unprecedented economic hardship during this pandemic, because we know that millions of workers and families are facing tremendous economic challenge, and we wanted to do whatever we could to alleviate that. And so that pause has done that, but it isn't enough. And so we do need to cancel student debt. President Biden can do that with the stroke of a pen, by executive action. And as far as an organizing action right now, how you can help us is in less than 90 days, student loan payments are set to begin with the same executive authority that was used to pause those payments. That executive authority can be used to cancel student debt. So I'm asking you to keep the pressure up. Amplify these things on social media, tell your story, speak to the impact that this is having on you and your household. What would you be doing? We hear stories of people delaying home ownership because of student loan debt, delaying starting or growing their family because of student loan debt, delaying starting a business, or still parents paying on their student loans and now starting to pay for their children's student loans. So this is a nearly $2 trillion crisis. There is something that we can do about it. Our calls for cancellation have really pushed the administration to also explore more targeted ways to cancel debt. As a result, we have seen some gains because of the pressure we've kept up. They've canceled debt for many borrowers that were scammed by for-profit colleges and veterans, and folks with disabilities who were scammed as well. That's a huge step, and this administration supports cancellation as a critical policy. But doing those carve-outs for veterans and folks with disabilities is really just less than 1% of this $1.7 trillion student debt crisis. And this is also a racial justice issue. If we were talking about how low Black home ownership is because of discriminatory policies like redlining, which restricted Black families' ability to build equity and generational wealth, we see that 85% of Black students feel they have no choice but to take out loans in order to pursue higher education. And then they are 5 times more likely to default than their white counterparts. People thought that by pursuing higher education, that would close the racial wealth gap, but it has only exacerbated it. And so canceling student debt, which President Biden has the authority to do, Congress gave it to him through the Higher Education Act, will serve as a strategy for a just recovery from the pandemic, but is an economic justice issue and also a racial justice issue. So where are we in the fight? Still fighting. What is the fight that's immediately ahead of us? Is in 90 days, that pause is set to end on student loan repayment, on student loan payments. And we don't want them to just extend that pause one more time. We want them to just cancel it. And we're asking for up to $50,000 of a cancellation again by executive action.
Great, thanks, Congresswoman. So next question comes from Michelle, who asks, how can we work to fight back against the unconstitutional voter suppression tactics by Republican legislators across the country?
Well, I mean, you know, as you so aptly put it there, the freedom and our right to vote is under attack. It is not hyperbole to say that our democracy is at stake. because of these coordinated efforts by Republicans across the country. They're doing everything they can to suppress votes with the support of the extremism of these far-right justices on the Supreme Court. And in Congress, Republicans have stood in the way of common sense reforms like early voting and automatic voter registration that would ensure that every citizen is able to vote. I mean, this is fundamental to our democracy. So these attacks on the freedom to vote, they stand to disenfranchise millions of Black voters, of disabled voters, of elderly voters. This is undemocratic. And these attacks create greater obstacles to the ballot box for our most vulnerable, Black, brown folks, voters with disabilities, working class families. We have got to fight back. And so, as I said earlier, the Senate must abolish the filibuster and immediately pass voting rights legislation, including the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So that's where we are in that fight. We're still in it. And the filibuster must be abolished to restore the voting rights that have been gutted. And again, that's why we need the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, but also to continue to advance reforms that will expand access to the ballot, because it is fundamental to our democracy. When we disenfranchise voters, we are silencing huge swaths of our democracy and our communities, and that is simply unacceptable.
Great, thanks, Congresswoman. We'll probably have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions. So we'll go to Elizabeth in Somerville, who says, thank you for the money that you have secured for sea level rise resilience infrastructure in Chelsea and Everett. I support your legislation to limit big banks' funding of fossil fuel projects, but what else are you doing to address climate change, including efforts to end the federal government subsidies for the fossil fuel industry?
Okay. You asked a pointed question, Elizabeth, so I'm going to do my best to give you a succinct and pointed reply here, because you already know what's at stake, so I don't need to editorialize here. I introduced the Fossil Free Finance Act to stop banks from funding new fossil fuel projects. And I continue to fight to end dozens of tax loopholes, subsidies, and other federal giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. The top 20 fossil fuel companies are responsible for more than 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions since 1965, with taxpayers footing the bill to subsidize these efforts. No more. And so I'm fighting to advance the larger investments, the largest ones that we can, in our clean energy future through the Build Back Better Act. Doing it better means doing things differently than we've been doing them. So that's exactly why we can no longer, taxpayers cannot continue to foot the bill to subsidize these efforts. And so the Build Back Better Act includes making renewable energy more affordable and available, building our network of EV charging stations, greening housing and transportation, providing fare free transit, funding community-led environmental justice projects in urban parks, and creating a civilian climate corps to create thousands of green jobs. And we have to pass a Green New Deal. And I'm excited. In the city of Boston, we've just elected in Michelle Wu, a mayor that's committed to advancing a Green New Deal for Boston. But we have got to advance a Green New Deal and these policies for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for our children. I was very proud to work with Chelsea, Everett, and our local partner organizations to secure that $750,000 in this year's appropriations bill to make the island and river waterfront more resilient to sea level rise. And I'll continue fighting to get these investments across the finish line. So thank you very much for your partnership.
Great, thanks. So I think 2 more questions we can probably slip in. So somewhat related. So question comes in from the chat. One of the undeniable lessons from the pandemic is that communities of color suffer the greatest health inequities, which is why Black people were disproportionately killed by COVID. How are you advancing health equity at the federal level?
Sure. Well, I think some of this was addressed just in having this conversation about climate and the disproportionate burden on our frontline communities, our environmental justice communities, which are by and large communities of color. And of course, we know that there is embedded bias in our healthcare system. And that's why I've introduced the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act in partnership with Congresswoman Barbara Lee out of California, and in the House, and then in the Senate, I've introduced this bicameral bill with Senator Warren. Again, this is the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act. This bill would create a national center on anti-racism at the CDC, so we can finally treat racism as the public health crisis that it is. And it's also about integrating health equity in our local public health departments, which my bill would fund. Every family across the Massachusetts 7th should feel confident that during the time of an emergency, whether a global public health crisis or an at-home accident, that local health personnel will have the knowledge and resources to provide culturally congruent and trauma-informed care. So that's what my Anti-Racism Public Health Act bill would do. I also want to talk about my Healthy Mommies bill that I introduced also bicameral with Senator Booker to tackle the Black maternal morbidity crisis. My paternal grandmother died in childbirth in the 1950s, giving birth to my uncle, my father's youngest brother, and the fact that Black women are still 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or in postpartum complications is simply unacceptable. And so our bill, the Mommy's Bill, will extend mandatory and permanent Medicaid coverage to a full year postpartum in order to care for birthing people and their babies. And by passing the Mommy's Act and the Momnibus package, we will reduce maternal morbidity in the Black community and throughout the entire country. One of the things I'm most excited about is that it covers doulas in insurance, and we know they've been proven to be very effective in saving lives. And then finally, I want to talk about our community health centers. I'm very proud that I have the most community health centers of any congressional district in the country. I have 15. 1 in 3 of my constituents receive their care from a community health center. We know with their diverse workforce and healthcare professionals, how critical they've been in providing culturally competent care and in combating health disparities. I think our community health centers have been overutilized and under-resourced historically. I do want to thank Michael Curry and before him, Jim Hunt, for their leadership as president of the Mass League of Community Health Centers. I continue to fight for robust investments for them, and during COVID was able to deliver some $56 million to the community health centers in the Massachusetts 7th. And again, there's 15 of them in my district, and 1 in 3 of my constituents receive their care from them. So those are some of the top lines when it comes to how we combat these racial health disparities.
Great, thanks, Congresswoman. So before we get to the last question, I do want to remind everyone that if your question was not answered live, our staff will be following up. If you pre-submitted the question, we will have your email and contact info. If you put your name against the question in the Q&A, we will do our best to reach back out and answer every single question that was asked tonight. Again, I do want to remind everyone that if you're looking for more information on the great work of the Congresswoman and our team, presley.house.gov is a great resource. And if you have any questions, you can call our district office at 617-850-0040. And so our last question comes from Chima in the chat. Chima's question is, what are you doing to create mental health equity? A little bit, more specific than the last question. Low-income individuals and people of color, particularly Indigenous people, are still underrepresented and underserved regarding mental health services. Can you share your legislative work in the mental health and trauma space?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's really my heart's work. In my 8 years on the council, I created a standing policy committee that named the issue of trauma, and it really dedicated my life in public service to preventing trauma and to combating and mitigating the impacts of it. I'll highlight really quickly a couple of things that I've been doing on that front. The first is to fight for robust investments that are equitably accessed by our young people. We know that our young people are carrying so much in their emotional backpacks as they cross into our learning communities. And trauma takes on many forms. Poverty is traumatic, food insecurity is traumatic, fear of deportation, being unhoused, exposure to gun violence, domestic violence. These are all things that have are not new challenges, but it certainly were exacerbated during the pandemic. And we've seen an increase and suicidal ideation, anxiety, and depression amongst our young people. And so those are investments that I continue to fight for. And I have my bill called Counseling, Not Criminalization, that incentivizes the federal government, instead of investing more money in school police, which we've done to the tune of $1 billion for the last 2 decades, growing our school police to 46,000, while 90% of our students don't have equitable access to a school nurse, a social worker, or a guidance counselor. And I've already enumerated all the ways in which our children and our most marginalized children continue to struggle. These investments are critical to their wholeness and their wellness, but also to their readiness to learn. I also convened the first ever congressional hearing on the issue of childhood trauma. And what we learned at that hearing became foundational to a bill that I've introduced called the Strong Children Act. I want to make sure I'm getting the acronym correct. I've introduced 91 bills in 3 years, so I want to make sure I get that correct. But again, that calls for some of the investments that I've already spoken to you about, just critical to the stabilization of our children. And then finally, I continue to lobby this White House to have a trauma-informed recovery. And in fact, I've asked them to do a summit, a White House summit on community-based responses to trauma. And just last week, I stood with my colleague, Jim McGovern, who has been a global champion in combating hunger, combating food insecurity, which certainly is very traumatic and only continues to grow. And we lobbied this White House to have a summit on food insecurity and to end the hunger crisis in this country once and for all. So those are some of the chief ways that I'm getting at it. And as I said, investment in our community health centers, and which have proven so critical to combating health disparities. And that includes barriers to access to behavioral health and mental health services.
Great. Thanks, Congresswoman. I know we're right at time, but I just want to thank everyone. And if there's any closing remarks you'd like to share, Congresswoman, we can close out here. Appreciate everyone's patience with us this evening for our first of many virtual town halls through the winter.
Sorry, I lost my visual here for a second, everyone. So I can't see you, and that's okay. Okay, here we go. I just wanted to say thank you all for taking time out of your very demanding and busy lives. I know there is so much going on, and some days all you're just trying to do is just stay above water. But I hope you have a little bit of peace of mind this evening in knowing that I'm fighting on behalf of you, your family, and your community. And I'll continue to do that. And please don't hesitate to use the resources that we've provided on this virtual town hall. And I hope you'll continue to join us so that we can provide you with these updates and more importantly, hear directly from you about what you're feeling, seeing, and what you need. Okay, so thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you to our translators as well. We appreciate you. It's so important that these forums are accessible to all, and so we thank you for the critical services that you provided this evening. And of course, my thanks and gratitude to my A-team, both in district here in Massachusetts and in Washington, D.C., for doing this work alongside me each and every day. Okay, so we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.